Greetings and salutations. This is Abe Abdelhadi with The Bitter Truth, where we may not have all the answers, but we're going to ask a bunch of questions. Tonight, I have the privilege of speaking to Ojo Taylor. Ojo was in a band called Undercover back in the day, Christian rock band, punk rock band specifically. Put out like 4 or 5 records. Did a lot of covers. They were in multiple countries. They've played all over the world. He is now a professor at James Madison University. He teaches rock history, publishing, all the legal aspects of music. And I'm really, really grateful to have him on the show tonight. Joe, are you there?
Thanks, Abe. Nice to be here.
Hey, thanks a lot, man. Hey, so jumping right into it, man, let's just kind of get into it. I mean, obviously, you and I talked the other night, and we have a shared similar background. I just maybe in the last few years started getting comfortable talking about my time in a couple of Christian bands when I was in college, and I never used to talk about that until maybe a few years ago I started getting comfortable with it. But
right.
But you know, why don't you jump into like how you came up? I know your childhood was a little different than what you ended up doing as a ministry, but why don't you jump into like how you came up and where you are now?
Yeah, well, a lot of my friends in Christian music kind of came up through, I guess, almost a Southern influenced Protestantism, and that wasn't the case with me. I was born into an Italian Catholic family. In fact, my grandmother was one of 18 kids. And so it was a very devout Italian Catholicism in Philadelphia. Church every week, and I was an altar boy when the Mass was in Latin.
Wow.
Went to Catholic school for first 4 years of elementary school. Went through all the sacraments, confirmation, all that stuff. The Catholic, I'm going to use this word mythology, and I don't mean it in a pejorative way, but I mean the stories of Catholicism, that stories like Our Lady of Lourdes, for example, and healings that would happen, and the Catholic tradition, stories of the saints, and all these kinds of stories. I'll use that word, stories, instead of myth, because I don't mean to imply that they're not true, but they have taken on almost mythological proportion. But anyway, those stories ran deep in my household, and they were meaningful to me. Movies would come out, they deeply influenced me in my Catholicism. But, sometime around high school, when you start looking around and seeing, having some insights about the way the world is, and keep in mind that, I was a pre-teenager in the 1960s, which was in the wake of Vatican II. Mm. And for those who may not know what Vatican II was all about, that's basically, the big news there was that the bishops and the Pope agreed that contraception was not going to become legal from a theological point of view, at least in the Catholic Church. And so there were all these issues that came up around Vatican II, not just about contraception, but about the role of women in the Church and whether they would ordain women as priests, whether nuns could... the role of nuns in the Church, and that was important to me because 2 of my cousins were actually nuns, and actually still are. But
wow.
I started looking at the Vatican and what they believed about certain things, and I just said, man, this just can't make sense to me. And so I ended up stopping going to church at all when I was old enough to kind of tell my parents, I'm not going. And I guess that was the case for a couple of years. And in the meantime, of course, I'm in high school, and that's where I met Jim, Undercover's guitar player, and we'd started playing around, learning covers and learning to be in a band. Sometime in there, I guess I was around 20 years old, my uncle, who was also Catholic, of course, told me that there was this church in Costa Mesa, Calvary Chapel, that was doing these Christian rock concerts, and because he knew I was interested in rock and was in a band, he said I should go down and check it out, which I did. And it was just a very different experience than what I saw in the Catholic Church. Rather than being rigid and having to get dressed up, I saw kids my age wearing whatever they felt like wearing, and they had smiles on their faces, and they were really enjoying what they were doing.
Right.
So, that resonated with me. And a couple of weeks later, I guess I went down for an altar call, and that was the beginning of my born again, if you want to call it that, evangelical experience.
And
followed.
How old were you?
Right. Go ahead.
How old were you?
I was. I guess I was 20 years old when that happened.
Okay.
So this was the era of, mustard seed faith and sweet comfort and gentle faith and all those, most of your listeners probably don't know who that was, but those were those early Maranatha Jesus music bands,
right?
Love Song, The Way, and all that stuff. And just so resonated with me at a number of levels. So, that's kind of how I got into the Christian thing. Now, I'm not sure where you might want to take it from there.
I was asking, I briefly knew Jim Nicholson for a little bit too. I mean, especially after, he was doing something else, and I was working in the record business at that time. When did you guys decide to form Undercover after doing this? Because you guys did covers, you guys learning songs, learning how to write music, or at least learning how to play music. When did you guys decide to do Undercover?
Yeah, so I guess Undercover came about. It was a little while later. We formed in 1980, and so I'm going to say, so Jim and I were doing covers, and it wasn't until we both became Christians that we finally decided, hey, let's just write our own stuff, because there weren't a whole lot of Christian covers. The
right.
songs that we want to cover, and get our own style and our own musical voice. So we did. So we were in a couple of bands iterations before Undercover, leading up to 1980 when Undercover finally formed. Now we through a number of twists and turns, and started at that point going to Calvary Chapel, Yorba Linda, which would later become the Vineyard,
right,
led by John Wimber, and of course John Wimber's son Chris and I were really good friends.
Okay,
and he headed up the Lifesavers,
right.
So, but before even the Lifesavers and Undercover, Chris was in a band called Boaz, and Jim and I were in a band called J.C. Rose, and we were kind of like benevolent competitors. We would play together all the time, but it was like, oh, our band's better than your band, but who's going to open up tonight? That kind of thing. Right. So Chris Wimber and Jim and I, and at one point, as music started changing in the late 70s, towards punk rock and new wave, we kind of evolved that way also.
Sure.
And I'll say Chris was kind of instrumental in my own influences, but there were other people there too. Rick Alba was involved in Boaz and then joined Undercover, and so we changed members and became Lifesavers and Undercover, and that was 1980, and then our first record came out in 1982.
Okay, and then I saw you guys in 1983. I was 19, and God bless her, I'm still friends with her to this day, but a girl that I kind of briefly dated, I was a Christian at that point behind my parents' back for about 5 years, and my dad was a Muslim, my mom was Catholic. They had this weird deal, and so the boys were going to be Muslim. That was that. And so I was sneaking around, and anyway, I didn't know any Christian music except for Amy Grant and kind of the things that you mentioned, which didn't do anything for me because I wasn't into that stuff. And then this girl I was going out with at the time took me to the Exit Festival at Citrus College, and that's where you guys played, and I saw the 77s for the first time and Steve Taylor, and I was like, oh my God, this is actually cool. I think Steve Taylor did a cover of Solid Rock by Dire Straits that night, which lyrically makes absolute sense if you're going to follow that. But that was sort of when I saw you guys. So only a few years before you guys just started, and your first record came out in '82. How did that come about?
Well, okay. So we started the group in '82, and as far as we knew, at least locally, Undercover and Lifesavers were the only bands that were playing that kind of music,
right, that
would fall into that punk/new wave sociology. Yeah, I never really referred to us as a punk band, but the comparison is clear, and there's clearly Orange County punk influences in what we do, and so we start playing around, and so the kids from the Vineyard were coming out to see us, and we were playing a lot of parties in people's backyards, and then we started playing. We would play for churches that were more adventurous. We would play in parks. We'd play in, and then it grew into finally nightclubs and stuff like that. But some of these venues, it just kept growing and growing and growing. And I remember just after our first record, it hadn't even come out yet. In fact, it had just been pressed when one of the, I don't remember who it was, somebody in one of the bands said, "Hey, we're having this burrito bash after church at Ray Hersum's house." Now, Ray was in both Lifesavers and Undercover too. He was on our first record.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Why don't you come over?" And so I went over to the house and walked in, and I was just floored because the kids, they were playing our record and the Lifesavers record, which also had just been pressed, and DA's record. I can't remember which one it was, around 1982. Maybe it was Horrendous Disc or one of those.
Right, Alarma.
When DA had maybe Alarma, one of those. But the house was packed with bodies and kids who were like pogo dancing in the living room and stuff like this. And keep in mind, this was like early 82, maybe late 81. So it just kind of snowballed and mushroomed from there. And, everywhere we played, it seemed like, and not just us, the Lifesavers as well, there were people, the places would sell out in no time. And then there were people 5 and 6 layers deep behind the windows trying to crane their necks and look in and see what was going on. And, so at that point, I think the church as an institution, at least locally, and then later the rest of the country would kind of follow suit. They had a decision to make. Well, we can either fight this or join it. We can either harness this energy or resist it. And then if they did that, well, then they risk losing their own youth. But in the meantime, we're like, well, we don't care if we play in churches or not. We'll play wherever we can set up. And if that's a secular venue, great. And we were, as a band, I think just as good as any other band on the Strip or anywhere else. So, it just kept growing and growing until finally, after our first record, Maranatha Music decided they needed to address this and started a rock label. And that's where we released God Rules, which was our first national release, but our second album.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and that was the album I got familiar with, and so coming out of that, because I don't want to spend the whole hour on that, although we could, because it was people don't understand now. I don't have a dog in this fight anymore. It's been like over 30 years. I got early release for time served, but what people don't understand about Christian music now, you can have different folks. I mean, I remember when Steve Taylor had a guy named Cactus Mosier playing drums for him, and I didn't.
Yeah, I remember Cactus.
Remember Cactus Mosier, older guy, and he played in some '70s band session guy, and I just assumed like I was a 19-year-old kid. I'm like, oh yeah, he must be the same way. And then I roadied for Steve Taylor at Cal Lutheran. A buddy of mine hooked me up, and it was a great weekend, whatever. And then I talked to him a little bit, and he just was sort of vague. And I was like, that's weird. He doesn't talk like the rest of these folks, And then a few years later, I'm working at MCA Records, and the country label, Curb Records, had signed Highway 101, where he was the drummer in Highway 101. And I was sort of going, interesting. Okay, so then I kind of figured out that, not everybody – it's a gig. It's a paying gig. Abe Laboriel Jr. plays for Paul McCartney now. He's a drummer for Paul McCartney. Right. And so people, they don't understand what it is now compared to what it was then. But then, you guys are trailblazing and selling records. I mean, I was in a couple of bands that really, we never got signed. We were just hanging out and getting some great gigs. But watching that movement carry forward to what it is now. I mean, back then, if you showed up to any church or some quote unquote Christian concert at a place, and you're wearing like a secular T-shirt or whatever you want to call it, like if you've got a U2 T-shirt or a Hoodoo Gurus T-shirt on, or REM, you'd get asked some questions. It's like, well, are you in the world and that kind of shit. Now nobody does that. So post Undercover, now obviously you did some more records, and the 80s went on and the 90s went on, and then you obviously got in academia with all your music background. So where did the transition begin where you started having questions of faith? Because I think a lot of folks get into a space where we're at now, or were then leading to now, and they don't actually ever want to question that. It's almost like it's an affront to them if you ask them for a specific proof or something that they hang their hat on other than that's how they feel. When did you start to kind of come out of, being in the ministry, quote unquote, to because I hate to say that, quote unquote, because your heart was right in the right place. And you guys got paid like any pastor gets paid. You know, it's like you perform a service, you're rehearsing 3-4 nights a week. You're writing and recording songs. That's at a cost. You're touring. You're spending money to get to wherever you got to get. So you were in the ministry. So how do you come into that space where you were in the ministry to start to have questions to kind of where you are now?
Yeah, well, you know, in some ways, I'm tempted to say I was lucky, but it's not that. It's not that at all. I have a lot of friends that are kind of stuck in that space still, and it's a struggle, you know, to be 50, 60 years old and having to play living room concerts to pay the rent. But for me, this is going to be kind of an unsatisfactory answer at one level, because it almost started becoming unraveled as soon as it started, like in the mid-'70s. And, you know, there were just things that didn't make sense almost right out of the gate. And one of those things was Calvary Chapel's emphasis on Jesus is coming back any day, and it's going to be 1988 before the rapture happens and all this crap, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so when people ask me, well, when did this happen? When did you decide to become an atheist? You know, and that's not what happened. I didn't decide to become an atheist. I tell people that it was truly a death by 1,000 paper cuts. and those 1,000 paper cuts happened over years, you know, where, oh, well, this doesn't make sense. Oh, well, that doesn't make, oh, well, that can't be true.
Right.
And then, you know, we come up with ways of justifying and rationalizing and you know, I can make scripture mean anything I want it to mean. I can support anything with it. And we do that. We look for verses that support our point of view, and we you know, self-confirming biases and all these things. So it was after our first tour in 1985, our first tour of Europe, I should say, that we came back and I realized, wow, Christianity overseas is a whole lot different than it is here in the U.S., and it makes a lot more sense over there. And that was kind of one stake in the ground. But it wasn't that long after that tour that I just gave up on evangelical Christianity altogether and went back to the Catholic Church officially. And so I went back to the bishop and I said, hey, you know, I haven't been involved in a church for a while, and you know, I'd like to explore coming back. And he, you know, so, but I qualified that by saying, but I want you to know that there's just a lot of stuff that I don't believe, and I'm not going to believe them either. You know, Catholic doctrines like, you know, the Immaculate Conception and this idea of purgatory, and there's a whole litany of things that I told the guy up front, I don't believe these things. And he said, well, let me go meet with my superiors here, and you know, I'll get right back to you on this. So he actually leaves the room and goes, about a half an hour later, he comes back and I'm sitting there and he says, well, we've decided that as long as you stay open to these things, we can welcome you back into the church. That sounded reasonable to me. So I made my return to Catholicism around 85 or 86. It wasn't until, I'm going to skip ahead about, I guess, 11 years, maybe 12 years before I actually had an episode that the 1,000th paper cut happened. Let's say.
The last straw on the camel.
The card that brought the house down was I had moved to Virginia to take the job at James Madison University, you know, and that was a big move for me because I didn't know anybody out there, you know. So I pick up. I had only been to Virginia once, and so anyway, I pick up my stuff and I move to Virginia and I take this job. Kind of a leap of faith, if you'll excuse the expression.
Yeah.
But so I'm gonna, you know, kind of put it all out there right now. But I went online to kind of meet people. You know, joined a dating website and start just to meet people. It's nothing else. And I did meet this one woman. I mean, I met her by emailing. Hadn't physically met her, but she claimed to be an atheist, and she was also a scientist. And I thought, well, that's weird. That's kind of interesting. I'd never met anyone that so just openly said, oh, well, I'm an atheist. You know, it's kind of like the kiss of death for social stigma and shunning and all that stuff. Anyway, we write back and forth, and in the meantime, she Googles me, and boom, all this stuff shows up about Undercover and being in a Christian band and all these interviews and evangelical background. And she fires off an email and says, well, I got to tell you, if you're going to try to save me from hell, and in fact, if you even believe in hell, I'm not even going to agree to meet you.
Wow.
And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I said, let me get back to you on that. And I thought about it, and I just realized all these years, all those things that hadn't made sense, all those things I had rationalized, all those things I had justified, I was just making shit up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And so that was my come to Jesus moment there.
Yeah,
if you will.
Listen, I will too. I say phrases like that all the time. It doesn't mean jack shit. I mean, I remember being 19 years old, having my first real questions, and I was in my first Christian band. And the joke I used to make when I was doing stand up was, some guys blew guys for crack money, and I played in 2 Christian bands. So there's that. But it's dark, but it is what it is. But no, I remember being 19 years old and having those kind of questions. And the first one was very base. I got to wait till I'm married to have sex? Well, what if I'm like 40? That's going to be weird. And it started from that question to, well, how come the New Testament and the Old Testament can't be reconciled? Well, Jesus said you have to, live the law out of love and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but he said some pretty separatist things too. He wasn't Peter Fonda, an easy writer. So I started having all these questions, and then I ended up in the Middle East in 1988. And I tell everybody, Christian, atheist, whatever, you should go. If you don't get your head cut off, you'll be all right. But back then it was a lot more mellow, if you want to call it mellow. But I was in the intersection of the big three. I was in Jerusalem, and I had met Christians and Muslims and Jews. I met a rabbi at the Wailing Wall, actually, who was trying to talk me into going back to my father's Muslim faith, which I thought was interesting. And it was all out of pride on his side because he couldn't imagine his son not being Jewish. And how much this must hurt my father and that kind of thing. And I was like, wow. So I was getting all this just stimuli. And but it started with that base question. And from that at 19 on through, and then just seeing how people were behaving. Because in the second band I was in, I was playing with a guy, and I'm not talking out of turn. He lives an openly gay lifestyle now and is very happy. He lives in South Long Beach. And we were in 2 bands together. And I was 18, didn't know anything. And, he was wrestling with himself, but, we're a Christian, you don't do that. And then we got in a second band together, and our guitar player was so mean. Like, he would just say things behind this guy's back. I go, hey, that guy's your friend, man. Like, well, yeah, I bet if he wasn't Christian, he'd be, well, what do you care? And that was, like you said, 1,000 paper cuts. That was just one after the other. And this was after I had some conversations between the ages of, say, like 19, 20, 21, where if I could find these people, and I don't have a lot of regrets, but some of those conversations, I was just a fucking bully. I was an asshole. Abortion. I was in Campus Crusade for Christ at Cal Poly Pomona, handing out tracts, doing all that stuff, and not having any regard for the feeling of people, And if I could find, there's like 3 girls that I specifically remember. If I could find them and apologize, I would. I brought them to tears over the abortion issue, and I was just an absolute asshole about it. And you're 19, 20 years old. You think you know, but you don't know. But just all of that was just a lot of questioning. And then by the time I got to Jerusalem and Bethlehem, I was like, Christ, I don't know anything, man. None of these guys are right. And I was already out of that second band about 6 months or a year. Then I started working at a record label and got into like a band. And then I did 2 more of those after that. But all that to say that, you think and you're so certain, and it's out of that certainty of having to know. And you talk to these people, like faith can't be proven. So why the animosity? I've seen your stuff on Facebook because we're Facebook friends, and you've got a lot of friends that agree with you and are kind of in your camp, and then you got some folks that knew you from the Undercover days, Broken Record days, and they just read you the riot act like you re-crucified Christ. Why the animosity, do you think?
Well, that's a good question, and your background is fascinating. in the 10 or 11 years that I've been an unbeliever, I've talked to an awful lot of people that have followed not the same journeys that I have, but similar journeys, and almost everyone has that story that, like you just shared your aha moment, and I had mine. That there's many different kinds of experiences that lead people to say, yeah, this isn't right, this can't be true. But I'll say this: it's very, very difficult for people to give up their religion, and it's because and maybe even giving up isn't the right phrase. But I'll say this with regard to like those people on my Facebook, and I'm sure you have them too. We all have them, detractors. Everyone's got their own path, and the minute I kind of understood that. That it's not my job to talk people in or out of any belief system, right, or convert them to the way I think or anything like that. It allows me to have a little more empathy, I guess, or compassion on people, while at the same time knowing that I'm not going to tolerate abuse or rudeness or disrespect or anything like that, especially on my own, Facebook feed,
sure,
or Twitter feed.
Sure.
But, so I don't know. The challenge for me is, I think for all of us, is that we're human beings first, and then we're whatever religion we are second. And the religious people see it exactly the opposite. They see religion being the big umbrella, so to speak, mm-hmm, and everything else is under that. And so for me, once I understood that I want to become my highest expression as a human being, that's going to involve difficult, virtuous decisions on my part to be compassionate and to empathize and to be kind whenever I can, and to help people through those questions, even if they come off as angry statements of absolute certainty, help them through that. And in that sense, being a professor, I find very helpful, because that's really what my approach with students is not, here, let me tell you what to think. Here are facts and figures that I want to cram into your head. It's not that at all. It's really more about learning how to think, and learning how to think critically, and learning how to analyze data, and learning how to come to grips with facts and also uncertainty. So these people that kind of try to do that, rip me a new asshole, rip you a new asshole, whatever, I don't see that as an opportunity to confront or argue and debate. I see it as an opportunity to practice compassion and empathy for these people. It makes it a lot easier for me. Sure. And then if I just stick to the facts, then...
But see, you get. I
don't know. Everyone, it's not easy. That's for sure.
No, but you see, but here's the thing. I believe you're 2 out of 3, or 1 out of 3. I agree with you on the debate issue. I believe you can debate compassionately and ask questions, because I was that guy.
Sure.
And I do get it. And right. and when I had my big last paper cut was in Denmark, coming out of the Middle East. My cousin hooked me up with a 4-day layover in Denmark. And I had my first beer. I was 23 years old, because I didn't drink, because I was a Christian.
Right.
And
that doesn't work.
And you know what? And as on a side note, those 2 bands I played in taught me a lot, because I had discipline from when I was in the 3 regular bands. And now I did my own weight in acid, and I did a fistful of fucking mushrooms, and I smoked pot and smoked hash. I did everything else after I made up for lost time. But I had the discipline of rehearsing sober. And I got that from playing in the first 2 bands I was in, because we showed up, mm-hmm, whether it was Jay's house or Don's garage or whatever, and we showed up and we were ready to go. And maybe 15 minutes late, but we were ready to go. And I learned how to write songs. I never played covers until now. I'm trying to get in a cover band at 54 as a fun thing to do, but I never played in a cover band ever. We as you understand, like you're an undercover, not because you're covering Larry Norman songs, right? So you got to write your stuff because there's nothing else to do. And so I learned how to write. I learned how to arrange, learn what lyrics were, keep it short, keep it sweet. And in 3 or 4 nights a week, it was like that 10,000 hours thing with Malcolm Gladwell. And so when I got into my first secular band, I was the ringleader. I was the asshole. If some guy showed up loaded, I lost my mind. I sounded like an old school record mogul from the 40s. Like, what are you doing? And because this is music. It's got to be played right. Do what you want to do after or before, but we're here. And I learned that ethic from being in two bands where we didn't do chemicals. We didn't drink. And so, I will give that credit. And like everything, it's experience. You can't regret it. Although, I don't know if you went through this phase, and I'll ask you this question and I'll just stop. I went through a phase of extreme resentment till about my late 30s. And then I finally got to this place where you're at, I think, where like I have compassion for people that still think like this. Yeah, because where I was seeing, it was almost tribal. So I had to like people were just, this is their tribe. They can't give it up. And so I started getting compassionate toward the idea, but I went through a lot of resentment from about 23, 24 to about like late 30s. Did you go through a phase like that or no?
I can't say that it was resentment, and I don't mean to imply that, I stopped believing and then I became this compassionate, Buddhist monk up on a mountain. It wasn't that. I guess my thing was, once I admitted to myself that, holy shit, I don't think I believe. I think I might be an atheist. Oh my God, I can't, coming to terms with that idea alone took probably 2 to 3 weeks. And I remember almost deliberately feeling like I shouldn't talk to anybody because my whole worldview has been shaken to its very core and foundation. I wouldn't know how to answer a question. And in fact, I did an interview with a Christian guy right around this time. And I remember having to sidestep certain ideas just because I don't know how to answer this anymore. So for me, there was a lot of uncertainty and fear initially. And I remember praying, oh, God, be gentle with me while I figure out if you're real or not. I don't mean anything by it, but I got to figure this out. And so it was a few weeks before I could come to the idea that, okay, like for me, the linchpin was hell. And once that card falls down, then all the whole other thing. Well, what about sin then? Oh, well, if there's no sin, which by that I don't mean that there's no, I don't think there's such thing as wrongdoing or evil, because that's not what I'm saying. But sin is like in terms of a grievance towards God.
Right.
That requires a blood sacrifice of God's only Son. And what about resurrection from the dead? All these other things have to be answered.
Right.
So for me, it was as I read and studied and saw what other people had to say about this, that it wasn't resentment so much as it was, hey, everybody, look what I found. You don't have to be a Christian. You don't have to believe this stuff. And I just kind of naively assumed that everyone would go, oh, well, look at that. How clever he is, you don't have to believe anymore. Okay, and that would be the end of evangelicalism.
That's hilarious.
But it is, and of course I'm caricaturing. It wasn't quite that.
No, I know.
Pronounced, but it was only later that I realized, holy shit, there are people that are not going to listen to objective evidence about scientific statements that they're making in the name of their faith. They're not going to listen to them. They're not going to be logical. They're not going to look at evidence. So then I had to start recalibrating, and that took a while. And
sure.
Where I did have some pretty vigorous arguments with people. And when that happened, I went back. I would get to my own space with myself at night and thinking, that's just not the person I want to be.
Right.
I don't want to be this argumentative asshole that just tries to prove everybody right or wrong all the time
right.
and prove myself right.
Right.
Well,
so, if you're being, if you're being sincere, that's the point, though, is you don't know, and there's a comfort in not knowing, that release. I remember about 8-10 years ago, I was talking to somebody, and this came up, and it was one of those hit by, the hand of God kind of moments, if you will, where he was being really snarky, because I was just like, I don't know, man. And he goes, well, what do you do for hope? And I go, well, sometimes I'm hopeless. Sometimes I'm hopeless for a couple of days. Sometimes I don't look good in yellow. You live with it. I don't know. You just move on, and don't make any permanent decisions today that you're going to regret tomorrow. Wake up tomorrow, and hopefully you don't feel like offing yourself. You do it again, and if you're being honest, that's as best as you can do. So, like what you're saying, I agree with you, because I went through this phase for a while where it was like fight, 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 and I know more Bible. I forgot more Bible than most people know, and blah blah blah. And then about 7-8 years ago, I just got to the space where I just don't give a shit, and I'll discuss it because it fascinates me. Theology fascinates me. The Muslims fascinate me. The Mormons fascinate me. I got friends in all those faiths. I got families. I got family that are Catholic. I got family that's Muslim. I've got tons of friends that are Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons and everywhere else, as I'm sure you do. But the thing I got to the space, like where you're saying, is that I had finally developed a compassion to not have to prove or save or do anything else other than just be and say my thing. And you're over 18, do what you want to do. It's like faith is almost like it's almost like homosexuality. Like the people that freak out if you talk about faith are the very same people that freak out if you talk about homosexuality. It's like, well, you're not gay, right? So what do you care? What do you care what somebody over 18 does? What do you care? They're not hurting you. They're not doing anything to you. They're just existing. So why are you freaking out that bad? Like, what did you see in Christianity that began the series of paper cuts? You said a death of 1,000 paper cuts. That's a great analogy because I can name you paper cut 800 to 1,000 that kind of pushed me over the edge. But what did you see in Christianity that finally got you to not necessarily make the tear, but just go, hey, this, I think I'm cool not knowing. What did you see? Because you were significantly more involved than I was. You were at a higher level than I ever was. I mean, I hung out with the Calvary guys, Raul Reese and those guys, and they were very nice people. I got nothing to say bad about them. But you were on tour nationwide. You did all these insane things. What did you see in Christianity as a whole that made you start to begin this series of paper cuts?
God, that's a good question too. I wasn't thinking about it in those terms when we were doing that, and these nice people that you mentioned, they're nice people, and except they hate Catholicism and they hate Catholics, and they will be quick to tell you why Catholics are going to hell.
Right.
And they're nice people, but they don't like and it's not that they don't like gays, but they think love the sinner, hate the sin, and they're going to hell, but we like them, and so there's all that dissonance that just doesn't work,
right.
Just doesn't work, and so I saw and heard a lot of stuff, but honestly, and I get this argument from people all the time too. Oh, well, we're so sorry that you've been hurt by other Christians, and that caused you to lose your faith. No, that's not it at all. Sure, I saw that there are people that are immoral that are in Christianity and in Islam and in Judaism and in atheism too. People are just people, and you're going to find virtuous ones and you're going to find crooked ones. But for me, so as I'm doing all that stuff that you just explained, and I'm seeing all these kinds of disconnects between what I believe the character of the founder of Christianity would be like versus what I'm seeing in this pastor, for example, didn't really cause me to challenge my own faith. I just always assumed that, that person hasn't figured that out yet. But for me, it was really the internal struggle and internal studies of, well, what are the claims Christianity makes? And can that stand up under its own weight? And it became very clear to me in that one episode, especially with the idea of sin and hell, that no, it can't. It can't stand under its own weight. So it's very much an internal process for me. I'll say this. I gave a talk at the Freedom from Religion Foundation a few years ago. Mm-hmm. And I was there with Steven Pinker and Jerry Coyne, which if your listeners don't know those names, you should look them up and read some of their books. But both fascinating thinkers. But in my talk here, the point that I was trying to make was, I'm not a scientist. I'm an artist. And I happen to know a few things, but I'm an artist first and foremost. And I can't prove to anybody that there is no God, like you said, this idea of uncertainty. I can't prove that, but neither can anybody else. That it can prove it either way, one way or the other. And for all the logic and good arguments that we might try to bring to the table, in the end, what's going to keep people from ditching or questioning their own faith is the idea that they don't have a worldview without it. In other words, well, gosh, if God didn't make the world, then who did? And if there's no God, or if my religion isn't true, then what does that say about morals or the origin of morality? And how can we have morality without God? And all these questions start coming up. And they're not easy questions. So people find it easier just to kind of default to the, Ten Commandments. And
yeah, but see, that's where George Carlin had that great bit about only 2 of the 10 Commandments are worth anything. The rest are like, don't fucking need them. I mean, don't murder, don't steal, don't lie. That kind of goes into don't steal. Okay, done. That's it. Lusting after your neighbor's wife, well, that kind of goes into don't lie because you don't want to fuck your neighbor's wife and then lie to him while you're mowing his lawn as a favor because you feel guilty because you fucked his wife. I mean, it goes on and on and on. But the other part of it is, and this is the part that drives me crazy. You said this a second ago, and I wanted to piggyback on this, where when people say things like, well, society's morality is based on religion. No, it's not. It's empathy. I don't want to be hit in the face. If I hit you in the face and you don't like it, well, then that should be illegal. I shouldn't hit Joe in the face because I don't like being hit in the face. I don't want to be killed and have my stuff stolen. So that should be a law that we all cook with. And so, but it's not a complicated argument. If you take intellectual and emotional truth and say, is it intellectually and emotionally honest to say that without God, I couldn't relate to being hit in the face or shooting somebody or stealing their stuff? I could. I don't need religion to do that. And the damage religion has done,
exactly.
You know what I mean? And the damage that is done in the name of God has been more than the good it's done. I got a buddy of mine, kind of like you, who went to Catholicism. He was a Baptist for years and years. I played in a band with this guy, great guy. And when he finally was, I remember about 10, 12 years ago, he's trying to get me back into church. He goes, yeah, I used to be that way. We should go back. I'm like, okay. I'm like, oy vey. So I go, I go back. I go to there's some Presbyterian church in Pasadena, and I'm listening to this guy, and I'm like, oh my God, I can stay home. I can stay home and think this shit. He is telling me that it's okay to be gay. I'm cool with that. I get it. I don't need a pastor to tell me that. I can watch football and go, hey, my gay friends, you're awesome, and I'm watching football. I don't need to go to a church on Sunday to watch this. And then a few years later, he became Catholic, and he's hardcore Catholic now, and to the point where he's always trying to get me to come in. And one of his most favorite arguments is, well, a lot of universities were started by Catholicism. Okay. And the Arabs invented algebra before they converted to Islam. What's your fucking point? I don't need it. And I think the sooner that people come to the point where they don't need it, if I sound resentful, I apologize. I think the sooner that people come to the fact that they don't need it, or if they do, they don't need to impose it on you, the better. I mean, I think, and I'm quoting Bill Maher here, but faith is basically making a virtue of not thinking. I mean, is that something you think is accurate, or am I off base there?
Well, it is for some people, and I'm going to have to avoid a sweeping generalization here because I know a lot of people that hold on to faith that are really quite brilliant and that have put a lot of work into thinking through their own thoughts and ideas and theologies. Those aren't thoughts and ideas and theologies that I agree with. Mm-hmm. And they're not thoughts, ideas, and theologies that I think can be supported as we would expect for any other objective claim about the universe to be supported. Okay. But, I wouldn't want to begin to accuse them of not being thinking people. Maybe when it comes to the masses, the workaday person who doesn't really know why they believe what they believe. But, this goes back to your question just a second ago. Why... so religion makes a lot of objective claims about the universe. The world was created in 7 days by God, and that there was a flood that covered the whole earth, and that there was, that there was a great earthquake when Jesus was crucified, and the graves of 500 people opened up and walked the planet. And these are historical, verifiable, they should be verifiable facts about reality. Right. The sun stood still in the sky for 24 hours, and why aren't we told in elementary school that those aren't actually true? Well, we're not told, and the reason why, I think, is because we have to treat religion with kid gloves, especially in America.
Right.
We can't contradict what religion says happened, and I think that's a big piece of the problem. So we are truly, in my opinion, indoctrinated at a very young age that these are objective truths. And then, by the time we're adults, it becomes very hard to separate all that fact from fiction and especially when, as I said earlier, that mythology, those stories are very, very strong and moving and powerful stories. God sending his only son, dying on a cross, and his mother Mary at the foot of the cross, and all these powerful imageries and which we invoked on a number of our records too. So it's really hard to untangle all that.
Well, it is, but that's where, like, for example, it gets back to like almost like a legal examination of it, right? You don't go on conjecture and supposition. You got to have fact. And to sit there, for example, and say, I used to do a lot of stand-up comedy from about the late 90s to roughly a few years back. I was doing a lot of stand-up comedy and had a bit on religion. When I got to headline, I would do this. It was like a 10-minute bit. But one of the points I would make is, why did God only ever show up to a guy alone in the woods? It was always Moses by himself, or Jesus by himself, or Joseph Smith by himself, or Muhammad by himself. It could never be like at the Super Bowl at halftime. Right? Like, you want to be, right. Like, if I was God's PR guy, I would go, here's what you do. You show up at the halftime Super Bowl, you kill Bruno Mars, but you resurrect George Harrison and John Lennon from the dead. The Beatles have a reunion tour. They do their 3-song thing, and at the end of Hey Jude, everyone's like, na, 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 with lighters, and just the stadium's losing their mind. CNN can't believe it. And then God shows up after the thing. Hey, he's 400 feet tall. And he's like, isn't that amazing? The Beatles are back together. You're welcome. And new album, new tour this fall. And by the way, blah, 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 blah. And he tells you what the real truth is, because everyone is just this segregationist, homophobic, misogynist group of people that want to separate us all and keep us divided. And there's no all God is one and one is the universe and death is an illusion. Whatever the thing is. And God tells us what's what. That would solve everybody's problems. Of course, you've got the 10% that, are conspiracy theorists and they think it's a hologram. But the 90% of us that saw it live on TV and the 100,000 people that watched the Super Bowl live and saw God show up would come back uniformly, and all of a sudden, bang, we would have this big kumbaya cakewalk up to Washington Square, and it would just be done. None of this like, oh, well, Jesus is waiting for the last days, and then he'll come back and he'll finally conquer the devil. Well, how come he couldn't conquer the devil in the 40s when the Holocaust was going down, or when Joseph Stalin was killing a bunch of Jews and all of his own people? Joseph Stalin, like 57 million people died under the communist Russians, and yet Hitler gets all the credit for 10 million people killed. And so all of that to say that, when does God show up and fix this? It's like the Batman chasing the Joker. We need a villain. And people refuse to ask that question. What if it's not true? I would rather, as Jesus said, I would rather be cold or hot and not lukewarm. I mean, I'm kind of like you. I remember when I started cussing a lot in my mid-20s. That's when I was sort of like, I really can't say I'm Christian anymore. I think I got a lot of issues coming out of the Middle East. I don't know if I can be a good representation of this shit anymore. And so I kind of kept my mouth shut. And within a year and a half, I was done. And it all started from a bunch of questions, 1,000 paper cuts, as you said. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, I think I'm done, man. I don't believe this. And what I thought at 24 is not what I think at 54, for sure. And it's evolved more. And it's, as you said, more compassionate, because you don't want to just beat people up for the sake of beating them up, right? But the other part of it is just this animosity to even asking a question. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, and I'm sure you've had way more because of your visibility, and also you're a much more open and less cranky person than I am, I think. But just to...
I think some people might disagree with you on that.
Oh, read my posts. but it's just to ask the question without name calling or any of that. Just to ask the question. brings about this animosity. I remember like this last couple of days I've been looking some stuff up that you may have said in print and everything, because I want to like tax your time and go, hey, what do you think of this? What he said it before, it's got to be there. And something you said that was really powerful was that the shit you took for a lack of sincerity, just because you're asking questions now, like they're penalizing a man in his 50s for the behavior of a 21-year-old boy. Right. And so, so how do you exercise compassion with that? Because I am still wrestling with that. Like, you're a smart guy.
Well, I don't, being in a band, one of the first lessons that you learn if you're going to survive is you can't buy everybody else's bullshit.
Right.
And you can't so I remember the first time I got a bad review for one of our records. And it was in CCM magazine, which now I should wear as a feather in my cap. But at the time, I was so deeply offended, and I ripped off a letter to CCM. Well, you guys don't know anything, all this stuff. So you learn pretty early on that you can't take this stuff personally if you want to survive, or if you don't want to have a heart attack, or if you want to have any kind of reasonable life with your kids and your lovers, You can't let everything get to you and get you angry. So I don't know, but so there's that. So when people pull this stuff, it's not so much that I don't feel anger or I don't feel hurt or that I don't feel attacked, but it's really my response to that that's going to rule the day. And I'm getting pretty good, or I'm getting better, I should say, at looking past the surface and seeing what's really going on there. And it's not that this person hates me or anything, because they don't know me. But a lot of what these people are saying is projection of what's going on internally in their own hearts. And that just makes it a lot easier to communicate with people. But, I want to go back to what you said a second ago, that if it were up to God, there could be irrefutable proof. And of course, the Christian or the believer will say, well, it's supposed to be faith. We don't have proof. To which I could say, well, okay, then why don't you just admit that you don't know? Because it's faith.
Right.
But they won't go that far either. So it's kind of a catch-22. But if you want to look at the Bible and people that take that as the literal word of God or the inspired word of God either, I have to look at that and say, is that the best God could have done?
Right.
Is the creator of the known universe, and this is the book we get? We could have had, in the earliest chapters of Genesis, hey, by the way, Adam and Eve, there's this thing called penicillin. We don't know about it yet, but you'll find it helpful down the road,
Yeah.
And here's the law of gravity. It will help you fly airplanes. You don't know what that is yet, but you'll figure it out. Why don't we get any of that?
Yep.
Why do we not get anything past Bronze Age morality and Bronze Age thinking? And to me, that means something. So,
but see,
but there's people that will take offense at that assertion. You can't tell them that, because then they get ruffled. They get their feathers up and all pissed off. And
but
stuff.
But you make a good point, though, because for instance, people, I got friends that will say, oh, science is so arrogant. I'm like, wait. If there's a second moon behind Pluto, science is A, the first ones to find it, and B, go, oh, this is why we had the galactical problem on Saturn or whatever, and they'll explain it. Whereas with people in the Bible, they'll say, nope, God said it, I believe it, that settles it, done. No questions asked for a book that's last edited 2,000 years ago. Right? And so
Yeah.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
And again, that's just a projection. Again, see, they project onto science what they hold about their faith, that it has to somehow be inerrant, that it can never make mistakes. And science isn't that way. Science makes mistakes all the time.
Right. And acknowledge
it's tentative, and it's actually science that corrects bad science. So, so this thing about Piltdown Man was a big hoax. Well, yeah, it was. And scientists, at least some pseudosciences, were the ones that enacted that hoax. But it was science that discovered it, not faith. not theology. So I don't mean to derail your.
No, you're on my point. I agree with it.
Yeah, it's just that the people say, well, science isn't always right either. I agree, it's not, nor is it supposed to be, nor does it claim to be.
But when was the last time you heard a theologian? When was the last time you heard a theologian say, "Oops"? Ever?
Yeah, well,
you don't. They don't fucking say "oops." They don't just go, "Well, oh yeah, Moses." I went to a bachelor party in January. Buddy of mine, good kid. I've known. He's like I want to say 36, 37. I'm older, obviously. And so me and a few guys were like the oldest guys in the party. There's like 15 of us. And, and he's Jewish. Like 10, 11 of the guys were Jewish. And so this was amazing. I'd never heard this argument before. So meet this guy at the airport. We share a car together to get back to the Airbnb that we're going to be staying at in Utah. We're doing all the snow shit, right? And we talk. He goes, "Oh, yeah, Ben told me about you, blah, blah, blah." I go, "Oh, okay, we'll start talking." And I'm the half Arab, half Brazilian anomaly, whatever. And he goes, "It's really interesting because I'm Orthodox, but I'm not sure about the Exodus." And I'm like, "What?" He starts telling me all this stuff that he'd been reading. Israeli, not Jewish, Israeli archaeologists were trying to obviously prove the Exodus because that's a core belief of Zionism. And that probably didn't happen. Because if it did, the Egyptians would have had hieroglyphs that 1 million of their slaves just fucked their economy and just walked out of Egypt, and now they got no one to do anything anymore, right? There's no proof of that at all. And just like there's no proof of a Jesus having died for our sins. And if you look at the backstory of, the Matrix or Horus or Vishnu or any of these guys who were the one who born on Christmas and, all this stuff, it's not a new story. But Christianity kind of benefited from the timing of media because they were about maybe 1,000 years away, 1,500 years away from the printing press. And so we went through the Bronze Age, and then where everything was dead for about 1,100 years, and we come out of it, and we get into the Magna Carta and all this stuff, and then we get into 1300s, 1400s, 1500s. Science starts to develop, and then they start to wrap their minds around the church because the church at this point had just developed such an anchor, right? And so it's kind of like where you're at right now. Once the mind expands, it can't go back. So when these folks try to, because I've had this too, where they try to coax you back in. "Hey man, this church is awesome." No. I'm sorry you had this experience with other Christians. I got some friends that moved here about 6 months after I did in Austin, Texas. And they were trying to get me back into church, unquote. And I thought I'll be open-minded. They go, "Dude, it's awesome. It meets in the back of this bar on Sundays before it opens." Okay. I go, and the guy's cool. He's got an Ace shirt and a bunch of tats. But he's saying the same fucking shit that I've heard since I was 13 years old. None of it's different.
Yeah.
And they're singing the same fucking songs, but with an acoustic guitar and a cool chick with a bunch of tats. But it's the same message. So how do you and honestly, you are a significantly superior human being to me. You sound like you have much more compassion than I do. No, I swear to God, I'm a dick. You sound like a very compassionate person still. How do you get around that argument when your mind is here? And you sound like you're at peace here. So how do you reconcile that with those folks that try to drag you back in when you know that's just not for you?
Yeah, it's not possible. In fact, I had this discussion less than 3 days ago with. So I just produced a record for Bill Walden, who was the first singer in Undercover. He's a pastor at Calvary Chapel Offshoot called Cornerstone in Napa Valley, and I love Bill. We have a lot of history. We're we're not best friends because I don't think such a thing is possible. But in my list of 10 best friends, he's got to be right up there, Mm-hmm. And I was the best man in his wedding. And so we just have all this history, even though we disagree rather wildly about these theological matters. And he was telling me that a post that I made on April Fool's Day, which just happened to be in the middle of one of those Facebook trends where, name the top 10 albums that had an impact on your lifespan, right? And so I'm listing all the records that were meaningful to me. And then it just so happened that on April 1st, April Fool's Day, I got this idea that I was going to just make a joke out of this one day. I put a Carmen record on there, and I did this whole narrative.
If you don't know who Carmen is, remember Zamfir.
The Carmen record wasn't. Right, but then I pushed the envelope a little bit, and I said maybe Carmen was onto something. Maybe I ought to reconsider, and then of course it's just April Fools, but there were people that were totally taken in by this. And Bill, I just was down in Napa a couple of days ago, and he told me that he read that post, and it actually got him thinking, oh my God, maybe he's coming back. Until he figured out that it was an April Fool's thing. He said it was kind of took the breath out of him. And I didn't mean to do that to him or anybody else, of course. But it's absolutely true. And I made the mistake of telling him, Bill, there is no, just as you said, once there is no coming back unless you have answers to all these questions. Right. And it's really as simple as that. If you want to support your faith, you're going to have to answer the hard questions. And then I made the mistake of saying, unless the sky were to open and, George Harrison would that whole scenario that you just...
Oh, I would do it in a second. I would do it in a second. A second. If I saw that during a hockey game or World Cup where God showed up and resurrected Lennon and Harrison and the Beatles got back together and did a 3-song set, I would convert to whatever you told me to. No questions asked.
Well, so... Yeah, and I get that. The mistake when I said that's a mistake for me because it left him with hope. See, well, I know people for whom the skies have opened, and they had a dream or a vision in the middle of the night. Their mother spoke to them in Swahili or whatever.
Fuck that. I'm back to Joseph Smith in the woods, a 14-year-old con man in the woods, finding plates that Moroni took back with him, and they still call him moron up in heaven because they're pissed off at him from taking the plates with him. That kind of thing is just that excuse, that making a virtue of not thinking. I get it. We have freedom of religion. I don't have to put the 10 Commandments on the State House steps. I could put it in front of your church, in front of your house. Everybody sees it. Nobody dies. We got to wrap up here in a couple minutes. This has been awesome. I'd love to have you come back. But just kind of as to wrap up, your final thoughts on, how you see I hate to say it, the advent of white supremacy sort of connecting themselves to Christianity in the age of Trump. Like that's a big subject. We could do an hour on that alone. But like wrapping up, how do you see that playing out in the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah, well, the problem is the people that think that there's such a thing as white privilege and white supremacy cannot convince the people that don't believe that there is such a thing. And so there's that. And I don't mean to say that I don't believe or do, I do believe there's white privilege and white supremacy is right on the face. But here's the thing. I get criticisms all the time. Why are you so political? Why do you spend so much time talking about politics? And 10 years ago, I might have given some credence to that question. You don't talk about sex, and you don't talk about religion, and you don't talk about politics. But we're in an age today where morals and ethics and politics are colliding.
Right.
And I don't see how you can claim to have any sense of ethical or moral sensitivity and not confront what's at risk in our society today. And that's everything from our friends who are married, that are gay, that are in same-sex marriages, to people that just control of women's bodies, the whole immigration thing. Which really is just a made-up problem more than anything, if you look at the numbers.
Absolutely.
I think I'm a little bit disappointed with a number of my, if you just want to look at the stats, 81% of evangelicals still support this administration.
Yeah.
There's a disconnect there for me, but even the 19%. Some of them feel like they can't speak out because it would jeopardize their fan base or whatever. I just don't understand that. Although I'm not going to, I don't want to tell anyone what they should speak out or protest or anything else. I'm just going to speak for myself and say that, to me, morals and politics are colliding right now, and I find it very troubling and almost impossible to keep my mouth shut. which has been a lifelong problem for me.
Well, but here's the thing. Like, I get that too. Why are you so political? And then I'm like, well, do you really give a shit if my I gotta put a restraining order on my ex-girlfriend? Is that interesting? Or a picture of my dessert or my stool or whatever. It's like I would rather ask questions and get the dialogue started, one conversation at a time, one party at a time, one bar at a time, one podcast at a time. And that's the thing where I think a lot of folks kind of lose sight of that when they go, and this is what's really funny. I remember about a year and a half ago, after all this Trump thing happened, and I had friends our age, 40s, 50s, and they're going, hey, man, I'm really sorry. I'm like, what? What do you mean? Well, you used to talk all this crap at the parties and things, and you guys would play shows, come see you, and then you'd get all political. And I'm like, dude, I don't have to think about that. I live in America. And then you'd be like really aggressive, and I didn't get it, and now I feel like I'm responsible. And I'm like, yeah, you kind of are. Because, like screaming at Trump is like yelling at the chef because the meal sucks, right? We fucked up. And this lesser of two evils has gotten us here, where we had a race to the bottom with a choice of syphilis and gonorrhea. And so people that support either of these people with a straight face, I'm like, okay, then you don't know anything. But then the flip side of all that is, wow, like now you're telling me that I'm right? It didn't dawn on you to have a little empathy, to understand that you had a freedom to say this stuff, to think this stuff? And now you feel bad? Now you're paying attention to the last 40 years now? And I'm like, okay, I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful that they're here now. But when they get angry with you about the politics, and listen, if you care about the pothole in your street, you're political. Sorry. If you care about the guy who can, kick Sarah Sanders out of a restaurant, or the gay anti-cake guy, you're political. Either way, you're political. And it's perfectly rational, because we vote in this society with the idea that our representatives represent us. And yet the Christians in this country continually vote against their own interests. So, and wrapping up, is like, I want to just let you finish off on this. How do you reconcile that with those folks that continually ask you that question? Why do you have to be political? Why do you have to, bash Christianity? Because I don't see you as a hostile person. I'm on your posts. I see your posts. How do you reconcile that with those people that you're just asking questions? They seem to think you're being sarcastic.
They do, and they misinterpret my motives all the time. And but again, that's an opportunity for me to check myself and check my own motivation and my own heart, because that's really what I want to do. I'm not in this to bash other people or to call them names or any of that stuff. But I think it's critically important that as a country, and not just as a country, but as a species, that we have these discussions, that we have this conversation. There are people that just are not going to want to do that. And okay, I can't make them want to have that discussion, but as long as my heart's right and I'm doing what you just said, ask questions, these are moral issues. They're political issues, but they're moral issues. How we're going to treat same-sex marriages, how we're going to treat people in same-sex marriages, how we're going to treat transgender people, how we're going to treat immigrants, what's our policy going to be? All of these questions, and it goes down to other matters too, income equality,
right,
tax policy,
right.
Very complicated issues. They're moral issues, and I think I've lost family members over it. I've lost friends over it, and as long as I check myself and my motivation, and I think that I'm doing my best compassionately and so on, then I've just got to keep speaking up.
Hey, listen, man, if you're all things to all people, you're either beige carpeting or a game show host. Folks, my guest has been
that's good.
you can steal that. I've stolen it. But hey, folks, my guest has been Ojo Taylor, to those of you who know, and Joe Taylor, to those of the people that are human and still care about sincerity and compassion. If these things make you feel uncomfortable, they're supposed to. So you sleep tight. Thank you and good night.